Beethoven composed the Sonata in C major, Opus 2, number 3, during the first years of his life in Vienna, around the year 1795, when he was about 25. He was then on the early rising tide of his fame and was beginning to make a strong impression on the city's chief music patrons and music lovers. A large part of this strong impression came from his piano playing, which was full of vigor, full of urgent, joyful emotion, full of drama, and as yet unimpaired by the loss of hearing that was to befall him later. Beethoven's first 3 piano sonatas, and especially this third one, reflect this youthful masculine muscularity. It is a work intended for a virtuoso performer. It taxed the abilities of the best players of its time and more than strained the capacity of the rather imperfect pianos available to the composer. The first movement calls forth great rhythmic zest. With only slight adaptation, its first themes could become good marching tunes. Right in the very first measure, there occurs a technical problem that has troubled many a student. It is that rapid figure in thirds that tends all too readily to become indistinct or smeary. I have found it profitable to play the D-F interval on the 4th beat with the thumb and 5th finger. Playing it the more obvious way with the 3rd and 5th fingers apparently does not permit the basically weak 4th finger to borrow the necessary strength from its too busy 3rd finger neighbor, thus causing the last 16th note E to be insufficiently articulated. I will admit that playing the interval of a 3rd with the thumb and 5th finger is something of a tight squeeze, and that my advice is better for small hands than for large. There is another difficulty connected with these thirds. Students often tend to play the first 16th note, B, D, too loud. The strength of this impact upon these first notes engages the muscles too firmly and also takes up precious time. As a result, the remaining thirds may bunch up into a paralyzed mess. My advice is play all the 16ths, and especially the first one, softly, and make the D-F the point of attainment, possibly with a slight accent. Like this. Not like this. I will do it again. And not this way. Measure 2, as well as measure 4, consists of 2 quarter notes, followed by 2 quarter beats of rest. The duration of this rest must not be guessed at. It is an integral part of the music, and its pulse, though silent, must be felt completely and accurately. The student is advised to count these beats out loud, or perhaps tap them with the foot to make absolutely sure they are there. After a time, he may substitute inaudible internal movements for the tapping. At measure 13, many editions indicate a pedal to be held throughout several measures. This procedure may have worked well toward increasing resonance on Beethoven's rather puny 18th century pianos, but on modern instruments, this pedal use may create an excessive welter of sound and spoil the passage's rhythmic impact. I would suggest a fresh pedal every half measure for 2 measures, and then a fresh pedal every quarter beat for the following 2 measures. In the middle of measure 24, in the right hand, the group of 6 30-seconds is written to be equal to 1 single 8th note. This comes out very fast indeed if the movement be played at the brisk speed that it deserves. I think that a little judicious, benevolent cheating can be accomplished here by beginning that fast note cluster just a shade ahead of schedule, like this. Measure 26 consists of 1 quarter note G in both hands and 3 quarters of rests. Again, these rests must be counted out accurately. It would be highly upsetting to jump the gun on the following melody. It ought to be like this. 1, 2, 3, 4, and so forth. That melody is flowing and rather poignant, in considerable contrast to the sharp attacks of the preceding phrases. In measures 31 and 32, the lowest bass notes, E flat, D, and C sharp, may be brought out just a little in order to make a firm purchase against which to point off the right hand syncopations, like this. At measure 47, the movement's true subordinate theme begins, sweet and flowing. Of course, it is a dialogue between the soprano and the tenor. It might be well for the soprano to take the lead for 8 measures and let the tenor make its rejoinder in a slightly subdued tone of voice. On the other hand, from measures 55 through 58, it is the tenor which takes the lead and the high soprano which chimes in a little more modestly, only to take the lead again in measure 59. In measure 56, the tenor melody reaches D, simultaneously with a B in the bass. It is difficult for most players to play this 10th in the left hand whilst also giving the D its proper expressive value. Moreover, breaking this interval makes an awkward sound. For any except the largest hands, this D ought to be struck with the right hand and held with the pedal to make a smooth connection with the next melody note B, which will be taken by the left hand. The syncopated measures 69 through 72 will achieve their greatest rhythmic interest if the on-beat notes, that is, the right-hand quarters, be played with a very short, dry staccato, while each left-hand octave be held down as long as feasible in order to be sure to give full value to the dissonance that it makes with the following right-hand interval, like this. At measure 78, there first comes up a troublesome little figure involving a grace note and a trill. Several problems are involved: playing the grace note, playing a sufficient trill, and giving the 2/16 their proper value. Theoretically, the figure ought to sound this way. With the grace note and the trill fusing into a group of 4 30-seconds, while the 2/16 retain their values as printed. However, this distinction can only be made when the movement is played at a speed which would strike us as rather too deliberate. For practical reasons, I would suggest that the entire little jigger be played as if consisting of 6 even notes, worth 1/4 note altogether, thus. The grace note, of course, represents the on-beat note. The synchronization of the hands remains difficult. I would suggest a regular fingering, beginning with the thumb in the left hand and the 4th finger in the right hand. Let the left hand guide the right hand, not the reverse. The broken octave passage, which closes the exposition, is marked double forte by the composer. Nevertheless, one ought to take care to prevent its degenerating into a monotonous clatter. I suggest the following procedure. Strike the opening G of measure 85 very loud. Then come down immediately to a mezzo forte or even a mezzo piano and make a crescendo to a double forte on the G 2 measures later. Then drop down again and make another crescendo all the way to the last low G 2 measures still further on. The left-hand 8th notes at the end will intensify the final loudness by their percussiveness, like this. In the development section, from measure 97 on, the loud zigzag broken chord figures in the right hand ought to be played with maximum brilliance. They will sound well if the first note of every group of 4/16 be given a strong accent, with the thumb, of course. This procedure also makes the passage a little easier, since jumping to each successive thumb accent will involve a certain amount of welcome relaxation. The long left-hand chords ought to be played with all available force, and the pedal kept down for the complete duration of any one harmony, that is, for 2 full measures at a time. Near the end of this passage, we may note the direction calando. This Italian word means drooping, in other words, getting softer and slower at the same time. Let the player and the listener get the full value of this marking, since a dramatic diminuendo and ritardando at this juncture will do much to point up the subsequent recurrence of the movement's initial motive in a colorful, unexpected D major. Beginning with measure 115, there occurs an interesting motive involving the upward leap of an octave. Both hands have the same motive, not simultaneously, but overlapping in time. The phrase's meaning will only be clear if special care be taken to have the one hand sustain the long note ostentatiously each time that the other hand plays a sharp staccato, like this. In measure 129 and corresponding places, the little 16th note figure is printed on the lower staff. It is very difficult for any except large hands to execute it with the left hand. Better use the right hand to play from the opening F sharp to the following A, and let the left hand take up again on the final F sharp of the measure. For 4 measures after 135, there is a long expansion of the dominant 7th chord of C major. It might be effective to play the entire 4 measures with the pedal down. The occasional blurring will not be too disturbing, and the sudden removal of the pedal at measure 139 will emphasize the entrance of the main theme in recapitulation. Take note that the left-hand octaves of measures 147 and 148 imitate and continue the right-hand melody of measures 145 and 146. The connection ought to be brought out. Listen. On measure 218, there begins a long extraneous passage that could best be called a cadenza. It ought to be played in a free style, dramatically, with due regard for its climactic goal, that is, the tonic 6/4 chord in measure 232. The passage following, without bar lines, ought to go very fast, faster than the movement's basic tempo. The final trill ought to be long, and the final hold likewise long. In the 3rd measure before the end of the movement, the left hand finishes off the passage in descending 8th notes, just as in measure 88. Many pianists have played these last left-hand notes in octaves rather than in single notes as written. I am in favor of taking this liberty, since it gives the movement's close a greater feeling of finality. Most of the lowest octave of the modern piano, the so-called contra octave, did not exist on the pianos of Beethoven's younger days. Yet when, later in life, he owned an English piano into which those low notes were built, Beethoven made ample use of them. The adagio of this sonata is its most profound, most deeply felt movement. I like to think of it as a dramatic scene enacted by a man and a woman. Not a love scene, but rather a gripping episode in which sweet concord is interrupted by a series of tensions and disturbances. Gentle harmoniousness reigns until measure 11. At that point, the signature changes to E minor. The rising bass octaves seem to depict the man striding forward slowly in some deep inner agitation. The C in the right hand at the beginning of each alternate group of 30 seconds adds a note of pain. In measure 13, the crossed over left hand expresses the woman's anxiety, a cry on high C, drooping in a sigh of 16th notes. The same kind of feeling is expressed in measures 16 and 17. At measure 19, the woman holds the stage alone for 6 measures. Her accented offbeat appoggiaturas seem to be pleading with great poignancy, but to no effect, for at measure 26, the man's agitative octaves again stride up far down in the bass, double forte, with much more violence than before, with a kind of slow fury. Alas, some nameless, fateful consideration blunts his passion, for after 2 measures he seems to recoil in inner frustration on a diminished 7th chord. Listen. fury and the frustration occur twice again. After that, the woman's pleading seems to take effect. The agitation calms down, and at measure 43, the quiet concord of the beginning returns. Not unconditionally, however. A terrifying sudden crash on a chord in a foreign key occurs at measure 53. The man's angry stride, the woman's pleading, all come back again, but with less violence, and the original harmonious piece then prevails throughout the movement's last phrases. Performance of this movement cannot fail to produce a great effect if its dramatic nature is properly understood and if it is delivered with great emphasis and conviction. The following few suggestions may be of help. The staccatos on the 16th notes in the very opening phrases are not to be taken too sharp or short. They are more like portamentos. At measure 26, it is best to add the lower octave, that is the contra E, to the left hand. There is a danger that the entire final section after measure 67 may seem to drag. Any dawdling there would be fatal. Rather than allow this to happen, a judicious slight increase of speed might be allowable. In measure 77, it is the lowest line of the bass, beginning on G sharp, that constitutes the melody and ought to be brought out. But in measure 78, the melody is transferred to the tenor, likewise beginning on G sharp. The third movement, called scherzo, is full of a biting, devilish humor. It is indeed in 3/4 time, but it had best be felt in one beat to the measure. The opening 3/8 notes and their many recurrences are not triplets, and one ought to try hard to avoid making them sound as if they were. Moreover, some players have a tendency to play the first note of the 3 too loud. This spoils the lift these quick notes are intended to impart to the downbeat quarter note immediately following. It is best to be careful to play the opening G very softly and give the quarter note A a little accent, like this. Not like this. The scherzo begins by treating its principal motive, especially those descending quarter notes, polyphonically, in fairly close imitation. The procedure is continued down to the first double bar, but after measure 11, the left hand has all the quarter notes and the right hand the eighths. Thus at measure 11, the left hand E flat marks the entrance of a new voice, and so does the row of left hand octaves beginning with measure 13. Each new left hand entrance of the 6-note motive ought to be brought out with a certain suddenness, possibly with a slight accent, thus. In measures 34 and 35, later also in measures 56 through 62, we find a series of sforzatos on the third beat, specified by the composer. These accents are not musically logical, since the chords on which they fall are merely dominant and tonic triads involving no surprise or tension. However, hitting an ordinary chord loud on an offbeat is one of Beethoven's very characteristic habits and illustrates the perverse vehemence in which he often indulged. I like to play these sforzatos with great ferocity. Shortly afterward, in measures 36 to 39, the initial figure of 3/8 notes is repeated several times in the right hand, involving a playing of the note G twice in rapid succession. It will avoid fatigue to play the first G with the second finger and the following one with the third. In measures 45 to 46, the soprano E is tied over the bar line before proceeding to F. This tie and progression will not be heard unless the inner voices of the right hand be greatly subdued. It might even be wise to make a crescendo on the soprano notes, beginning as early as measure 43. It is especially the inner A C sharp at the beginning of measure 46 that must be kept down so that the upper E can sing toward F, like this. At the brisk speed at which I like to play this scherzo, the arpeggios of the trio come out very fast indeed. Too fast, perhaps, for many players. There is no objection, I think, to reducing the basic speed just a little so as to accommodate those right-hand triplets. The dominant seventh arpeggio at the very end of the trio, beginning on the high F, had best be distributed among both hands. Use the regular fingering, 5-4-2-1 in the right hand and 1-2-4-5 in the left. Play 8 notes with the right hand until the next to the last note, G, of the measure. Then play the next 4 notes with the left hand, the following 4 again with the right, and finish the final 3 in the left, like this. Right hand now. Now left hand. Now right hand again, and finish with the left hand. The tempo indication of the last movement is allegro assai. Please remember that assai means very, a lot, or plenty. So if this movement is to step up the muscular stimulation of the scherzo still further, it must go at a very considerable rate of speed. It will never get off the ground if delivered in too easygoing a fashion. Thus, the 16th note passage beginning in measure 8 presents quite a challenge, especially in measure 18, where the last group of 6 16th notes dashes to the chord beginning measure 19. I suggest that at that point the hand be raised between the passage and the chord so as to give the latter a firm, strong downbeat. A slight loss of time here would still be preferable to a loss of emphasis. Like this. Incidentally, this movement contains a characteristic little 3-note motive which constantly recurs in the course of various themes and episodes. It consists of 3 notes of the scale descending diatonically, usually in even rhythm. I call it the 3 blind mice motive. The first intimation of it is at the end of measure 3. The left hand gives it very conspicuously several times after measure 9. The bass plays it very distinctly a number of times after measure 30. We find it again in the right hand of measures 57 and 58, and imitated in the left hand of measures 59 and 60. In the melodious F major middle section, beginning with measure 103, we find our little descending 3-note motive forming the entire upper part from measures 105 to 110. Some further technical suggestions. In measure 30 and beyond, it is best not to try to articulate the left-hand 16ths too distinctly by means of the fingers alone. I like to hit the lowest bass notes a smart little rap with the 5th finger, jump off them instantly, and play the broken chord figure by wiggling the wrist, keeping the fingers close to the keys. Measures 87 to 95 are a especially difficult problem that has annoyed pianists for generations. There is no solution for it except steady rhythmic practice without looking at the notes. As for fingering, I suggest that the left-hand thirds in measures 88, 90, 92 to 95 be played so that the first third is struck with the 4th and 2nd fingers, while the last third always be played with the 2nd finger and thumb. This may facilitate some of the dangerous jumping. Turning toward the end, in measures 271 to 277, there is no need to cumber the right hand by playing the changing double notes as the direction of their printed stems seems to indicate. One had best take only the top single notes with the right hand and play the rest as simple, regular staccato thirds with the left hand. The long trill in measures 287 to 290 had best be executed by using the hands alternately, each one gripping a sixth with the fifth and second fingers. Let the left hand be on top, playing F, D, the right hand below, playing G, E. When the additional interval appears in measure 289, let the left hand play B with the third finger, and the right hand play C with the fourth. The rallentando from measures 300 to 303 ought to grow a good deal slower than the callando from measures 296 to 299. It is quite acceptable to play the final left-hand octave an octave lower than written, thus letting the great work end most assertively on a booming low contra C.